Welcome, Father Massingale.
Hey. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Hello. Oh, come on. Good evening, good afternoon, hello. It is so good for us to be here. Turn to someone and say, it's good for us to be here. It's good for us to be here. Those were the words that Peter spoke to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration when they gathered, and he said, Lord, it is so good for us to be here, and it is a joy for me to be with you at this Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. This is one of the highlights of my year coming here. This is the largest Catholic gathering for social justice in the United States. You make it happen, you being here. Thank you for being here. There are so many other places and things you could be doing. Thank you for being here right now at this time, our time. Now, I always look forward to being at the teach. But this year, I had some kind of trepidation, because they asked me to break open the theme for our gathering, steadfast hope in precarious times. And I thought, oh no, precarious times. Precarious is a scary word because it means exactly that. Precarious means scary, dangerous, risky. When we feel unsure, where things are unstable, where we feel vulnerable. But then as I was researching word clouds about precarious, one word kept standing out, and it was the word nasty. Nasty. We are living in nasty times, where conversations can be uncivil, strident, bullying, not kind, mean, vengeful. This is heavy stuff. And so I'm going to invite you to go on a journey with me. I'm going to do something risky. I want you to come with me on a journey when we're going to have an adult conversation. We're going to have an adult conversation about what's going on in our world and in our country. And it means that we're going to have to look at some really tough stuff. If I weren't wearing a collar right now, I'd say another word that begins with an S and ends in T, and you can kind of, it says shoot. We're going to talk about some really shooty things. Oh, you must be Catholic because you know exactly what I was talking about. We're going to have to do some really tough stuff and look at our world. But then after that, I want to do three things with you in my time. I want to look at our world and look at our country and ask, what is so precarious and scary about what's going on today? And then I want to look at a deeper reason for why things are the way they are, and why we're so scary, and why things are precarious, and why things are uncertain. And then I want to talk about hope and what it means to have hope even in the midst of times that are scary and uncertain and when we sometimes feel afraid. And I want to talk about love and courage and hope. And when we get to that last part, when we get to talking about love and courage and hope, I'm going to do something risky because I'm going to give, it's probably going to be the most personal talk I've ever given as a priest in 41 years. Because I too live in this precarious time. I too feel uncertain, risky, insecure. I feel sometimes vulnerable. I feel afraid. And so I'm grateful that they asked me to talk about hope because in Think about what I was going to say to you. I had to talk about me. And by doing this talk, I got hope. So let's begin. Looking at the signs of the times. The signs of the times is that phrase from Vatican II, that landmark meeting in the Catholic Church that updated the Catholic Church and brought it into modern times. And it said that the church had the obligation to search the signs of the times, those things that are going on in society that call for a response in the light of the gospel. And so I'm going to raise up some things that give us an understanding of why and we live in precarious times. The first, back in 2023, last year basically, the Human Rights Campaign, which is one of the foremost LGBTQ advocacy groups in the United States, for the first time declared a state of emergency for queer folks in the United States. They talked about the rise in anti-LGBTQ violence, evidenced by the tragic shooting that took place in 2016 at the Pulse nightclub, and then later on in Colorado at a bar there in 2022. This disrespect and anti-LGBTQ violation are further evidenced by the Don't Say Gay bills that have been passed around our country, where teachers can be criminalized for even mentioning gay issues or even acknowledging that there are queer students in their classroom. We live at a time when parents of trans kids are seriously considering or indeed uprooting their families, moving to places so that their children can have access to life-saving, gender-affirming care. If we are an LGBTQ person, and in case you didn't Google me, yes, I am a proud member of the LGBTQ community. I just want to put that out there. Our LGBTQ siblings, we're living in precarious times. We are living at times when there are severe constraints on teaching about race. There are bills that have been passed not only in Florida, but in Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Alabama that basically restrict what people can learn about our troubled history about race in the classroom. These laws have been passed ostensibly so that people won't make students feel uncomfortable about their race. But we have to ask ourselves, which students aren't supposed to feel uncomfortable? These laws are passed so that white students aren't made to feel uncomfortable when talking about our nation's tragic, deep complicity with violence and with racism. Indeed, in some schools, you have to teach that, slavery was not a bad thing because African migrants learned useful skills. This is another reason why we live in precarious times. We live at a time when there's growing intolerance based upon faith and religion. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are not new. Unfortunately, these have been stains in our country's history for too long. But the recent war in the Middle East has brought things to a boil. After the horrible, reprehensible terrorist violence that was inflicted upon Israel last October 7th, but the equally reprehensible violation that's been inflicted upon the people of Gaza. Both of these are terribly tragic wrongs. Both are reprehensible, but both have also magnified the scapegoating of Jewish and Muslim citizens in the United States. Another reason why we live in precarious times. We live at a time of increasing controversies over immigration in light of our country's changing demographic. Even as we gather, hundreds of migrant children are still separated from their parents and their families 4 years after they were caged. 4 years after they were caged, as their parents and their families came to this country fleeing physical persecution, sexual violation, and other forms of violence. It's a terrible stain upon our nation's history, as these people, fellow human beings, are scapegoated as invaders, parasites, rapists, and vermin who poison the blood of the nation in our political discourse. We meet in the aftermath of severe hurricanes, Hurricanes Helene and Milton, that have caused suffering that is still afflicting some residents in Florida and North Carolina as we gather. Florida is one of the most exposed states in the nation to the ravages of severe climate disruptions caused by human-induced climate change. And yet efforts to respond to these human disruptions are stymied by political denial. Florida passed a law which the governor has signed that strips the term climate change from much of state law and reverses policies that promote green energy for fossil fuel. We live in a time of climate change and climate disasters. That's precarious. And then, as if all of that weren't enough, you may have heard we're having an election now. You may have heard. And you know, we live in a kind of contested political divisions. Now, again, there have always been political differences. There have always been Democrats, Republicans, independents, and none of the above. That's not new. Differences are natural. Differences are normal. But what is not natural and not normal is when those who differ from us have become enemies. Enemies who some call to be arrested, even eliminated. And we're living at a time where we can't even imagine or envision or even desire a state of common life with those who disagree with us. Ecological changes, crises, upheavals over sexuality, political differences, climate change, all of this contributes to a situation where we feel nervous and uncertain and anxious, precarious. But now we have to go deeper and ask ourselves, why? Why is this so weird? What's going on? We're going to have an adult conversation. It's going to be a little heavy, but we need to go there. Because otherwise you talk about hope and it sounds pie in the sky, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to be realistic. What's going on is that there are many people who are anxious about a loss of status, feelings of status loss. The world is changing, and they're losing their preferred state in society. You heard that I wrote this book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. I published it in 2010. It's getting to be kind of old now. Except there's one line on page 14 that I wrote back in 2010, and now it haunts me even more in 2024. My biggest fear as this nation moves into an inevitable browning is that there will be a very powerful minority, overwhelmingly composed of Euro-Americans, who will see themselves in significant danger as a consequence of how democracy works, winner take all. And they will begin to renege on some of the basic principles that created the United States and made it what it is. I wrote that in 2010. It could have been written yesterday. We are living in a time where people are anxious about the kinds of changes that are taking place. And it seems like we're a country that's increasingly at war with itself, torn between ideals of fairness and justice and peaceful transfer of power and respect for democracy and respect for those who are different. And those who are saying, wait a minute, if those principles lead to a society where I can't have my own privileged place, then we don't want that anymore. And we give it a fancy name for this ideology. We call it white Christian nationalism. But white Christian nationalism is essentially the belief, an instinctual belief, a visceral belief, a non-rational conviction that this country and its political institutions and its history and its culture, that these belong to one group, namely white Christians, and especially white Christian men, in a way that it does not and should not belong to others. Now, relax, y'all, because I can see people's blood pressures going up. When I say that this is an ideology that white Christian cisgender men believe that the country belongs to them in a way it doesn't belong to others, it doesn't mean that all white cisgender Christian men think that way. Relax. I know white cisgender Christian men. I lived with them in a seminary. I taught them, and some of them are really cool people. But that does not mean that there are others who looked at the diversity that we talked about before, that there are people here who are Catholic and Protestant, and there are people here who are Jewish and Muslim, and there are people here who are gay and bisexual and transgendered and lesbian, and there are people here who are cisgender and heterosexual, and there are people who look at that and say, that's precisely the problem. We're not a white Christian nation anymore, and we need to bring it back because that's what Jesus wanted. Seriously. And so we want to bring back that lost world, that lost utopia. A scripture scholar named Walter Brueggemann put it this way. He said, we, a certain we, have lost the capacity to maintain our kind of America, one that's populated solely by white neighbors led by males limited to heterosexuals. And that loss touches every dimension of our common life with a pain that is too painful to acknowledge. So we need to bring it back. But then, in the next sentence, this noted scripture scholar was almost prophetic in words he wrote in 2015, but have become too apparent now. He said, back up here, great. Sadness over loss that is unvoiced, unembraced, and unacknowledged turns to violence and precludes movement toward new possibility. Or, to put it in another way, in the words of a black gay author, Joseph Beam, in a more rap cadence, he said, anger unvented becomes pain, pain unspoken becomes rage, rage released becomes violence. And what we are seeing and why things are so precarious is because the violence we've seen about race with the killing of people in Buffalo, New York, who are simply going grocery shopping and were killed because a man sought deliberately to kill black people, or the caging of children, or the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Islamophobia, all these, the anti-gay violence and violation and precarity that we see, all of this is because our society is changing in ways that people are uncomfortable with, and it must be rejected. And as a result, we're living in a precarious time, folks. And it's scary. It's a time of risk and uncertainty. And I know this is heavy, heavy stuff. I know it is, and you know what? I can't apologize for it, because if I came up here and just gave you the sunny talk about hope is wonderful, y'all, and just hang in there, you would look at me and say, Father Massingale, you are a fool, because we all know better. It's just that we don't just lay it out like that, like this. But unless we're honest about the fact that we can be afraid and we're living in some difficult times, now we can look at hope. And now we can talk about what does it mean to be a person of hope in the midst of these difficult times. And so now I want to talk about courage, love, and hope, because this is the part of the talk. The first part of the talk is like, okay, now what do I do how would I respond to this? And it occurred to me that no matter how bad things get, we never lose our capacity to dream and to imagine a different kind of world. James Baldwin, noted African-American author, my hero, he once said, you know what? I can't live in despair, no matter how bad the world is, because I can't tell my nephew, I can't tell my niece, you can't tell the children there's no hope. And so guess what, y'all? I'm going to follow his advice. I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you there's no hope, because you know what? There is. But to do that, I have to get really, really personal. And so here we go. That's my grandma. Oh, I know I love her. That's my grandma. And when I graduated from 8th grade, she gave me a graduation gift. I had to check a bag to get this here, okay? It's the Webster's Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language. I love the description. My grandma, just in case you can see it later, to my grandson on his graduation from 8th grade, class of 1971. I'm old, y'all. From his grandmother, with love, for Bina Gibson. 979 pages of dictionary definitions, plus another 500 pages of reference material in black leather bound, plus gold leaves. It's amazing. And people looked at my grandmother and my family and said, are you nuts? Why are you giving a 14-year-old boy a 979-page dictionary? And she looked at them and she said, because someday he will need it. Now, my grandmother was not delusional. She knew that we lived in a neighborhood with a corner store that was rodent infected, that my brothers and sisters we called Rats and Roaches Incorporated. We lived in a neighborhood with violence and with drugs and gangs, but my grandmother also wanted me to know that that neighborhood did not define or limit who I am or who I could be. And so this dictionary was her act of hope, her act of vision. My grandmother dreamed even in precarious situations. We'll come back to this. The second story I want to tell you is that I recently came back from South Africa. I was there in South Africa for a month doing research on how Pope Francis's call to decriminalize homosexuality is being received in the African context. And while I was there, I met with a group of LGBTQ refugees who were living in a safe house in Johannesburg. There were 17 people there, people who are trans and lesbian and gay, who came from Ghana and Somalia and from Zimbabwe and Zambia, who fled their native lands in order to come to South Africa because it's the only country on the African continent where LGBTQ rights are constitutionally protected. They uprooted themselves to flee from violence and persecution. And some of the violence and persecution is caused by the church. Some of them have been talking about witch hunts that were organized by Catholic priests and bishops. I met with them and I asked them, I said, am I the first priest to ever visit with you? And they said, you are the first minister of any denomination that ever came into our house. One of them, a lesbian activist, she spoke about her experience of experiencing an ordeal of corrective rape. That's the practice by which they take lesbians and force them to have sex with a man in order to make them, a woman. After she talked about her experience of rape, she talked about her activism and she said, I do what I do for the younger me's out there. I want them to have a better life than I did, so that they never have to go through what I did. And I was so impressed and so deeply moved that despite everything she went through, she still had hope. She still dreamed of something better. No matter how bad things get, we human beings, we never lose our capacity to dream. Robin Kelley, a Black historian, says that dreaming means that we create spaces for collectively imagining alternatives to precarity, to poverty, to prisons and premature death. And then we plan to bring them to fruition. Dreaming is envisioning somewhere in advance of nowhere. Dreaming means living in possibilities, living in a reality which does not yet exist but must surely come. Dreaming is not fantasy. It's not denial. Dreaming asserts a refusal to be bound by the evidence of what is there. Dreaming is a refusal to live within the limits of the status quo. Dreaming is an act of saying no, none of the above to the options that are given to you. Dreaming is a choice to live in a world that does not yet exist, but which will surely come. And no matter how bad things get, we human beings never lose our capacity to dream. And so I want to go back to those stories I told, the story of my grandma and the story of those advocates and LGBTQ persons in South Africa, and talk about 3 lessons that I learned from them about hope. The first thing I learned is that dreams and hopes are fueled by love. All the great social movements for justice in our society have strongly emphasized a love ethic. That's what the author Bell Hooks has said. And when we Christians dream, we dream with the dreams of Jesus, because Jesus came to give us a love ethic. When Jesus came and he gave us a dream, it was a dream of shalom, peace. But shalom, that Hebrew word, means much more than peace. It means wholeness, completion, abundance, where everyone has all that they need for a full and complete life. And Jesus meant that dream of abundance and fulfillment to be for all without exception, no matter your race, no matter your ethnicity, no matter your color, no matter your gender, no matter your gender expression. All means all, no small print, no exclusions. That was Jesus' dream. That's his love ethic, abundant life for all. We translate that today, many of us do, when we talk about the dream of the beloved community. The beloved community was that dream that Martin Luther King had, of an inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith community where differences are not a cause for fear, but a source of celebration. And then his widow, Coretta Scott King, kept that dream of the beloved community alive, but then she expanded it by saying that the beloved community is not just a community that eradicates racism and poverty and war, but it also needs to stand against misogyny and homophobia, because if we're going to have a beloved community, you can't have a community where women are not seen as equal and where homosexual people aren't seen as equal. And she caught some heck for that. I haven't watched my language here. She caught some heck for that. People saying, well, you gotta be careful because King didn't say that. And she would say, well, wait a minute, if anyone understands Martin Luther King, it should be me. I think I know. All means all. And then Pope Francis just yesterday issued a new encyclical, Dilexit Nos. He loved us. Jesus loved us. It's all about Jesus' heart, his sacred heart. And what Francis says is that we live in a world that has lost its heart and it needs to rediscover it. Because all the major questions, the existential questions, who am I and what do I give my life to? And for what purpose am I in this world? What meaning do I give to my life experiences? Who am I for God? All of these questions, Francis says, leads to the heart. Hope is fueled by love. And so when we Christians talk about our world, and when we talk about the values we bring to the world, and when many of you go to Capitol Hill on Monday and talk about values, we don't bring political values to the world. We bring gospel values to the world. Truth is not a political value, it's a gospel value. Integrity is not a political value, it's a gospel value. Respecting those who are different is not a political value, it's a gospel value. And respecting women and women's ability to lead is not a political value, it's a gospel value. Don't take my word for it, look at the Bible. Jesus with the woman at the well. Jesus with Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. In all of these situations, Jesus never insulted and demeaned women. Jesus always affirmed women and their leadership gifts. That is a gospel value. But if we're going to talk about those gospel values, we need to have courage. Because doing the risky thing, standing up for the gospel, is not easy, and you're going to catch some hell from it. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be uncertain. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to do what is right and to stand for the good and to pursue righteousness despite being afraid. Or the way I put it when I teach at Fordham, superheroes don't need courage. Superman doesn't need courage. Superman's invulnerable. You can shoot bullets at him and they bounce off of him. Wow, that's something, you know. You don't need courage if you can't be hurt. You don't need courage if there's no risk. We need courage precisely because we can be hurt, because we are afraid, because there is a risk in doing the right thing. And that's why we need courage, because courage gives us hope for justice. What you see here is from the National Memorial for Peace and Freedom in Montgomery, Alabama. It tells the story of America's journey from enslavement through mass incarceration. And it also talks about the horrors of lynching, where thousands, unknown numbers, frankly, were brutally, publicly lynched because they were the wrong color. And at the end, there's this waterfall. And it talks about how we will remember those who are tormented and terrorized and abandoned by the rule of law. We remember with hope, because hope is an enemy of justice, and with courage, because peace demands bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, and with faith, because we shall overcome. Courage gives us hope for justice. And this is where it gets really personal. Because as part of this memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, they have a wall of names at the end. And on this wall, in the 1870 census, for the first time, the freed African slaves could be counted in the census as human beings. And many of them, for the first time, could choose a name. Some of them kept the name of their slave masters. Others got other names that they thought better described them. And so the names of all of the enslaved who were counted for the first time in a U.S. census are inscribed on this memorial. And you can go to the park ranger and you can ask them locate your name. So I went to the park ranger. I said, can you find Massingale on there? And he said, Massingale, that's kind of a strange name. I said, I know. I never got that one before, but let's see. So he typed in his list and said, yeah, it's here. I said, what? And that's me pointing to my family's name. That they were one of the enslaved that were counted for the first time in 1870. And I felt some kind of way about it. But then I remembered that the reason they could be counted is because they survived. They could be counted because they endured. They endured horrors. And they still found the capacity to love and to dream and to form a family, even in the midst of precarious times. Bryan Stevenson is the founder of this. Some of you know him through his books, Just Mercy and that. He talks about courage and hope. And he says we need to stay hopeful because hope is your superpower. And so we need to believe in things you haven't seen, to believe you can do things that haven't been done before. And so at the end of my tour, I went to the bookstore and the gift shop and got the shirt. Hopelessness prevails. Injustice prevails because hopelessness persists. Hope is your superpower. And when we are hopeless, that's the guarantee that our world never gets better. But when we hope and dare to dream, that's when we can make a difference. If you think that change is impossible, guess what? Nothing changes. But when you dare to dream and dare to imagine and dare to have hope, that's when things change. I was going to wear this. I was going to add this big plan. I was going to take off my collar, and you're going to see this amazing T-shirt underneath. But then I was rehearsing it, and it never happened elegantly. And it occurred to me that the only thing you would remember then is seeing my naked body up here. And I said, that's not a good look. Believe you can do things that haven't been done before. Because the final thing I want to share with you is that we can dare to hope because we're not alone. Hope is not a marathon. Hope is not a sprint race. Hope is a relay race. And when you run a relay, your goal is not to be the one to break the tape at the end. Your goal is to run your race the best you can, both to honor those who have gone before you and for the sake of those who will come after. And so we're running this race. And why this gives us hope is that we can't give up. Because if you give up running your race and doing your work, then nothing can happen. The people who come after you can't do anything. And so I really want to encourage you, don't give up. Hope is your superpower. Because regardless of how the election goes, the work of justice must and can go on. Our work, our cause, our passion, which is also the passion of Christ, will not go away no matter who wins. Because no matter who wins, the hungry must be fed. No matter who wins, the homeless must be sheltered. No matter who wins, immigrants will need protection. And no matter who wins, those who are strangers among us, those who are strangers, considered strangers because of who they love, or how they look, or what their race is, or what their gender or gender identity is, all of those people need to be welcomed and embraced. We can't give up because we are needed. And we're part of this chain of justice seekers, justice creators, and justice makers. And we do what we do for the sake of those who've gone before us and for those who are going to come after. And that's why I hold on to this book. I rarely use it anymore for its intended purpose. I can't tell you the last time I've looked up a definition here. Anything that's in this book I can find on my app, or I can Google, or I can ask Siri. But I hold on to it because a concrete sign of what can happen when you refuse to settle for the status quo and dare to dream that life could be different. Before I came down here, I had a moment. I was talking to my grandma, and I said, "Grandma, did you ever imagine that when you gave me this book, that I would be standing before 2,000 people? Did you ever imagine when you gave me this book when I was 14 years old, that I would be a public person standing for justice?" This is the power of dreams. This is the power of hope. I'm going to end here. I've been doing a lot of praying lately because our country needs it. And you know that there are 11 American saints, and none of them are black. But there are 6 saints in process. We call them the saintly 6. These are people of deep faith who did amazing things in difficult and dangerous times. Of the 6, 5 were born in slavery. One, Theo Bowman, was born in a time of American segregation. All of them had to fight obstacles. Augustus Tolton, the first recognized priest, couldn't even study in the United States. They sent him to Africa to study. They never intended for him to come back to the United States. 2 of them founded religious orders for black women because no convent, no religious order would accept a black woman as a member. They faced obstacles and terrible things that we can't even imagine, racial insults and humiliations and exclusions. And yet, they accomplished great things. They built organizations. They educated. They healed. They preached. They spoke truth to power. And we can be inspired by their example and their courage. I pray to them because they're Americans and they know what our country is and they know what obstacles we face. And so I pray to them for our country. And when I pray to them, I feel a deep sense of hope because they showed us how we can live and how we can hope, even in precarious times, because when we do so with God's help. And so with God's help, dare to dream, dare to imagine, dare to hope, and then dare to be surprised at the awesome things that can happen. Be people of steadfast hope, even in precarious times. Turn to someone next to you and say, be a person of hope. And tell them, I will be with you. We will be there together, and together we will be the hope that our nation and our world needs. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless us all.